Chapter 1. A Feast That Became a Legend. Every year, across the United States, families gather around glowing tables, golden turkeys, mashed potatoes, and laughter. A ritual of warmth and unity. We call it Thanksgiving. A word so familiar it feels eternal, a symbol of peace, gratitude, and family. But beneath the smiles and pumpkin pies lies a much older, far more complex story. A story born from struggle, faith, and survival, reshaped by politics and myth, and remembered today through a lens both comforting and false. To understand what Thanksgiving truly is, and what it became, we must go back to a small wooden ship, battered by winter storms, and the desperate souls aboard it. Chapter 2. The Voyage of the Mayflower. The year was 1620. Aboard a cramped, creaking ship named the Mayflower were 102 passengers, a mix of Puritan separatists fleeing England's religious persecution and Anglican settlers hired for profit by merchant adventurer Thomas Weston. They had secured a patent from the Virginia Company of London, intending to settle near Jamestown, Virginia. But fate had other plans. The Mayflower was blown off course, landing not in Virginia, but in the icy reaches of New England. On November 11, 1620, the exhausted travelers dropped anchor off Cape Cod, far north of their intended destination, isolated and ill-prepared. Winter had already begun. Their supplies were nearly gone. There were no crops, no shelter, and no one to help them. To survive, they stole corn from Native American storage pits, raided graves, and hunted what they could. Between December and March, half of them perished from disease, malnutrition, and exposure. Death stalked the colony, until salvation came from the woods. Chapter 3. Samoset, Squanto, and Massasoit. In March of 1621, the surviving colonists were startled when a native man strode into their settlement and greeted them, in English. His name was Samoset, of the Abenaki tribe, and he would change everything. Samoset introduced the colonists to Tisquantum, a man we now know as Squanto, and to Massasoit, the leader of the Wampanoag Confederacy. Squanto's story was one of tragedy and resilience. Kidnapped years earlier by European explorers, sold into slavery in Spain, freed by monks, and carried to England, he finally returned home, only to find his entire tribe dead from disease brought by foreigners. Despite his loss, Squanto became the bridge between two worlds. He taught the settlers how to plant corn, find fish, and survive the New England wilderness. In March, Governor John Carver and Massasoit signed a peace treaty, promising mutual defense and cooperation. For the moment, peace held. And by autumn, thanks to Squanto's guidance, the colonists' first real harvest was ready. It was time to celebrate. Chapter 4. The First Thanksgiving. The year was 1621. Governor William Bradford and Captain Miles Standish decided to hold a harvest festival to give thanks for survival and abundance. 4 men were sent out to hunt waterfowl, and they returned with enough to feed the colony for a week. Then, unexpectedly, Massasoit appeared, with 90 Wampanoag warriors. The colonists feared an attack, but instead, the Wampanoag joined in the feast. They brought 5 deer, and for 3 days, English settlers and Native Americans ate, played games, fired muskets, and feasted together on venison, roasted ducks and geese, clams and eels, white and cornbread, leeks, herbs, and wild berries, and wine made from wild grapes. No mention of pies, no cranberries, no wheat. They had no ovens, no butter, and no sugar. Yet, for those 3 days, there was laughter, food, and, perhaps, a fleeting sense of peace. But as with all peace in early America, it would not last. Chapter 5. The sources and the silence. The story of that feast comes from only two original sources. Mort's Relation, 1622, by Bradford and Edward Winslow, and Bradford's later journal of Plymouth Plantation. Neither text calls the feast a thanksgiving. Bradford simply wrote that they gathered in the small harvest they had, and blessed God. In Mort's Relation, Winslow mentions the harvest and the three-day festival, but says nothing about invitations or holidays. In fact, the Wampanoag were likely not invited at all. They came when they heard musket fire, thinking the colonists were under attack, and only then joined the celebration. The truth of that brief moment would be forgotten for centuries, and when rediscovered, it would be transformed into something very different. Chapter 6. The Making of a Myth. For over 200 years, the story lay buried. Mort's Relation went out of print. Of Plymouth Plantation was unknown until the mid-19th century. Then, in 1841, editor Alexander Young reprinted the account, calling it The First Thanksgiving. In 1856, Bradford's journal was published, and 2 years later, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish, romanticized the Pilgrims into national heroes. The myth was born. The grim survival of 1621 became a moral fable, a vision of peace between noble settlers and generous natives. A story of America's humble, righteous beginnings. And as this myth spread, the darker truths, the grave robbing, the theft of corn, the wars that followed, were quietly erased. Chapter 7. War and Days of Thanksgiving. As English colonization expanded, the fragile peace collapsed. Between 1630 and 1636, over 20,000 colonists arrived in New England during the Great Migration. Land was seized, treaties broken. The Pequot War of 1636 to 1638 erupted when the Pequot tribe resisted English expansion. The result was genocide. Entire villages burned, survivors sold into slavery. The colonists of the Massachusetts Bay Colony declared a day of Thanksgiving, not for peace, but for victory. From then on, Thanksgivings were often proclaimed before or after battles against Native Americans. To the victors, it was divine providence. To the native peoples, it was the beginning of centuries of mourning. Chapter 8. Sarah Josepha Hale and the National Holiday. 2 centuries later, one woman would reinvent Thanksgiving entirely. Her name was Sarah Josepha Hale, editor of Godey's Lady's Book, and one of the most influential women in America. Starting in 1846, Hale began a relentless campaign to make Thanksgiving a national holiday, a day of unity, gratitude, and faith. For 17 years, she wrote letters to every president. Finally, during the darkest days of the Civil War, President Abraham Lincoln answered her call. In 1863, Lincoln proclaimed Thanksgiving a national day of gratitude, not for conquest, but for unity and healing. And so, the myth of the Pilgrims merged with the politics of a nation at war with itself. A century later, in 1963, John F. Kennedy reaffirmed the holiday, again as America struggled with social division, officially establishing the 4th Thursday of November as Thanksgiving Day. Chapter 9. 2 Thanksgivings, 2 Truths. For many Americans today, Thanksgiving means family, football, and feasting. But for many Native Americans, it remains a day of mourning. As authors Yvonne Joachim Dennis, Arlene Hirschfelder, and Shannon Flynn wrote, the tale ignores the Wampanoag who brought most of the food, ignores the pilgrims who plundered native graves, ignores the reality that Thanksgiving was never called such in 1621. Native peoples had been giving thanks for thousands of years before the Mayflower ever sailed, through rituals honoring the Creator and the earth. Their ceremonies of gratitude were ancient, sacred, and peaceful, long before the colonists arrived. Yet history chose a different narrative, one where peace was invented by the colonizers and their violence quietly forgotten. Chapter 10. The Modern Thanksgiving. By the 20th century, Thanksgiving had evolved again. The harvest feast became an emblem of American identity. Presidents used it to call for unity during war and upheaval. Companies turned it into a celebration of abundance and consumer joy. Today, Thanksgiving marks not only gratitude, but the beginning of the holiday shopping season. For some, it's sacred. For others, hollow. And for many, it's both. Chapter 11. The Real Meaning of Thanksgiving. In 1621, for 3 brief days, 2 peoples, who barely shared a language, sat together and shared a meal. They did not know they were making history. They only knew that for one moment, they were alive and grateful. That fragile peace would not last, but it was real, and perhaps, in remembering it honestly, we can still find meaning. Thanksgiving, at its heart, was never about the perfection of a myth. It was about survival, about the human need for connection, about gratitude, not for what we own, but for what we share. If that lesson survives, then maybe so does the hope of that first feast. This was the true story of Thanksgiving, from feast to myth. If you enjoyed this journey into forgotten history, subscribe for more deep dives into the untold stories of our past. Because sometimes, history's greatest legends are built not on truth, but on the stories we choose to believe.